When my son Dom was young, he was obsessed with dragons. He loved to draw them and to read stories about them, and he had a fairly large collection of ornaments that he called his glass dragons. When he was about 6 or 7 years old, he decided that all he really wanted for his birthday was for me to get some bits of cotton and make a dragon picture for him. That was how he phrased the request. Fortunately, my sister stepped in and obliged in producing a fantastic cross-stitch picture of a dragon and castle for him that year. Dom had, and in fact still has, a book called Dragonology, which was beautifully presented like some of those classic books on nature, and it contained maps and drawings and a whole lot of facts and information about dragons. Around a similar time, there was a programme on television that used very realistic CGI to look at the science of a dragon's ability to fly and breathe fire. These two things in combination particularly reinforced Dom's opinion that dragons must be real, something that he was very insistent on. Dragons were a massive part of our lives when Dom was small. We were always looking out for anything to do with dragons, and most of the things that he read or watched on television were dragon related. I even have a dragon tattoo which I got when Dom was about 4 years old, so I have a permanent reminder of the huge place dragons occupied in our lives for a number of years. Dom and I haven't had a conversation about dragons for quite some time now, but I assume that at some point between the ages of 7 and 23, he came to realise that these much-loved creatures existed only in art and imagination. And I feel quite sad about that in some ways. It's sad that the world gets smaller as we get older. As adults, we think we're so big and clever and so rational, and yet we often live a much reduced existence compared to that of a young child. I heard a programme about dragons on the radio over the weekend, no doubt on the back of St George's Day last week. In part, it explored the role dragons have played in our national identity through poetry, story and song. In England, we know stories of St George and the dragon. In Wales, a key story is that of the red dragon fighting the white dragon. The presenter also looked at dragons as metaphor a bit more broadly and read a poem, I didn't catch who wrote it, that described all the things that we don't understand as dragons. This instantly took me in my mind to some of those ancient maps that were as detailed as they could possibly be, but where things were potentially unknown and dangerous, the maps carried the mysterious warning, there be dragons. We all encounter dragons from time to time, although we may or may not choose to describe them as such. A few years ago, when I was deliberating over whether to slog on with my PhD or to give it up, a friend who was also a university lecturer asked me if it was a dragon I really felt I had to slay. He said that unless my subject was for me like a dragon in whose face I could do nothing else but fight, then a PhD can be exhausting and debilitating and soul-destroying. This was the best advice he could have given, and I realised that I just didn't care enough about my subject to continue. We all face dragons from time to time, things that seem massive or frightening or unimaginable or inexplicable. These might be personal issues for us, or they might be things of national or global importance. And we can respond in all sorts of ways. We can pretend that the dragon isn't there. We can run away or adopt the hedgehog response, curl up in a ball and wait for the danger to move on. Or we can decide to stand and fight. And we don't always have to respond in the same way each time we face a dragon. That said, I think there are some dragons that should always be fought when we encounter them. The dragons of racism, sexism and homophobia have ravaged our country and our church for centuries. Sometimes we've ignored those dragons. I know that when I've heard people saying things that are discriminatory, I haven't always challenged them. And sometimes I've just tried to change the subject or avoid being drawn into anything confrontational. My silence has allowed the dragon free rein. Sometimes we even feed those dragons, allowing them to thrive and to grow because they're supported by our systems and processes, or even by our interpretations of the Bible. Things like slavery and apartheid in the past, and even homophobia still today, have flourished because people have found some kind of biblical warrant for them. This is an unpalatable truth, but I think it's important that we acknowledge it. As Christians, we haven't always stood alongside the oppressed, the excluded, the minority. We've been part of the system, part of the structure that has done the oppressing, and at times we've pulled up our drawbridge to keep the excluded out, and we've thrown the marginalised, the other, to the dragons. We think we're keeping ourselves safe, but we don't realise that we're only making the threat bigger. We're becoming part of the dragon, which will one day consume us too. On a global scale, the dragon of climate change needs fighting, or its fire will devour us all. It's not good enough to pretend that it's not in our interest to fight, or to wait for someone else to act first. I recently read an article that explored the relationship, particularly the financial one, in the US between fundamental Christianity, the Republican Party, and fossil fuel companies. And it was frightening to see how a biblical justification is given for not doing anything about global heating or other environmental issues. It made me physically sick, almost, to read that a popular opinion is that Revelation tells us that the world will end in a catastrophic apocalypse, and therefore to hasten that day is to actually be doing God's work. This couldn't be further from what I see in the Bible about God's love and care for all creation, and our responsibility to be agents of that divine love and care. Climate change is a planetary dragon that needs to be faced and fought right now. I'm reminded of the sleeping dragon Smaug in The Hobbit. Years of accumulating food and wealth and facing no real resistance have made the dragon content and lazy. He hasn't needed to expend any energy in fighting for a very long time. He sleeps, protected and powerful and complacent, thinking that no one will come and disturb his slumber. It's only when Bilbo dares to enter his home under the mountain that the dragon awakens and shows his face again, and it's only in revealing himself that he can be defeated. I wonder, how many dragons do we allow to sleep and grow powerful through our inaction? There are huge inequalities in our local communities, an ever-increasing gap between the richest and the poorest, and that's just in this country. It gets worse when we look at the inequalities that exist between nations. The pandemic has highlighted that for us quite starkly, I think. In this country, we face an obesity crisis, while there are many parts of the world in which food is in desperately short supply, and people die of starvation and malnutrition. Things like food poverty and funeral poverty and period poverty are very real issues in this country, and not just in lands far, far away. Financial insecurity is a reality for many people, with a third of adults having savings of less than £500 and 10% of adults having no savings at all. In the year preceding the pandemic, there were nearly 300,000 homeless people in the UK, yet the 2018 figures showed that there are nearly 252,000 second homes owned by people in this country, and 2020 figures show that 268,000 homes in this country are empty for more than 6 months a year. It feels to me like multiple dragons are circling in the skies overhead, and the majority of us are keeping our eyes firmly fixed on the ground. Even if we acknowledge the threat, it's hard to get away from the natural inclination to let somebody else do the fighting for us. We're still in the season of Easter, and we celebrate the fact that Jesus fought the dragons of sin and death. Jesus tackled them head on. It cost him his life. It looked like loss, but Jesus fought and he won. His resurrection and ascension opened the way for the Holy Spirit to be released powerfully into the world, a symbol of the resurrection that we're invited to share, and the source that equips us to step into Christ's risen life. Those massive dragons of sin and death come to us in many guises, perhaps in smaller forms that we don't always see for what they are. They come in all those things that I've already described. The most powerful weapon we have against them is love that God has given each of us, and that is enabled and strengthened by the Spirit. God has given us love, that makes us see and feel and care and respond and act. God has given us love, love with which we can fight exclusion and oppression and climate neglect and poverty complacence and all the other dragons we face. If we're invited to share in Jesus' risen life, and if we're challenged to become his body in the world today, then we cannot ignore the dragons. Perhaps individually we can't fight them all, but together we can. I don't want to live in a world or be part of a church where we're happy to let injustice go unchallenged. We can do this. So let's open our eyes, not just to the wonder of the world around us, although that's a good thing too. And let's expand our horizons, allowing God to give us much broader vision that sees possibilities and potentials, not impossibilities and limits. And let's look out for those dragons all around us. And let's be prepared to fight them wherever and whenever we can.